Exalted Third Edition is known for being mechanically complex, and its combat system can be adored, intimidating, or outright annoying depending on who you ask. Personally, I enjoy it, but I also know it well and try to approach its flaws creatively. The combat system is based on withering and decisive attacks, where you use withering attacks to build up a resource called initiative, and decisive attacks to use that initiative as physical damage. The withering attacks are cinematic shifts in momentum, while the decisive attacks are what will essentially take out your foe. However, not all decisive moves are attacks. Some are gambits, special combat maneuvers meant to create advantages for yourself or disadvantages for your opponent. Gambits are often underused in favor of the certainty that comes with direct attacks. They are also often underestimated, and when used can make an otherwise stiff combat scene feel more dynamic and fun. In this video I'm going to go through the basic rules for setting up and executing gambits. I'm then going to cover the universal gambits that exist in the core rules. Finally, I'm going to provide suggestions for how you, as storyteller, can apply custom gambits to your boss fights to encourage players to try creative approaches to combat outside of directly trying to cause harm. There are some universal gambits in the core rules, such as actions to disarm, unhorse, distract and grapple opponents. But gambits are also customizable in that they can act as a solution to any action in combat that isn't covered by the rules. First, the player declares what they want to get out of their action. In some cases they know that they want to do a gambit, but in other cases the storyteller might make a ruling. Then they need to make a decisive attack against the opponent targeted by this action. If the player succeeds on their decisive attack action, they use initiative like with other decisive attacks, but not for damage. Instead, the rolled initiative must overcome the gambit's difficulty rating. The universal gambits that are mentioned in the book have listed difficulty ratings. If it's a situational gambit, the storyteller determines an appropriate difficulty. The difficulty ratings are kept relatively low to encourage players to use gambits at lower initiative. Since most foes only have 7 health levels, gambits are recommended to not have a difficulty higher than 7. Then it would be safer to just make normal attacks. Since the player has already succeeded at overcoming their target's defenses, this additional gambit difficulty tests how well they can perform the action itself. The fact that they rely on initiative to pull off also helps to restrict their use in combat. Think of the gambit difficulties as a form of hardness instead, with higher difficulties representing more complex actions that require more initiative to set up and can be used less frequently. When you want to execute your gambit, first declare decisive attack against your opponent. If the attack fails, you lose initiative like with normal decisive attacks. If it succeeds, you roll your initiative, which must match or exceed the gambit's difficulty. If it does, the gambit succeeds. Regardless of whether it succeeds or fails, you lose initiative equal to the gambit's difficulty plus 1. You cannot attempt gambits where this would take you into initiative crash. You can attempt to disarm an opponent as a difficulty 3 gambit. If successful, you knock a weapon out of their hand and fling it out to short range. The target must move to the new location and use a draw or ready weapon action to retrieve it. This gambit is very effective against foes that rely on melee and are bound to using their weapons to be effective in combat. Since the difficulty is only 3, you don't need an excessive amount of initiative to pull it off. If you're a storyteller and want to put pressure on your group in combat, have your NPC make a disarm gambit against a PC who's a melee specialist to disrupt their momentum in combat. You can unhorse an opponent as a difficulty 4 gambit. There are several benefits to fighting from the back of a mount. You get a speed bonus that may be applied to your combat movement actions. You get a bonus to withering attacks and to defense against non-mounted opponents, though the defense bonus only applies to close combat attacks. This gambit lets you knock a target off their mount, inflicting bashing damage to them and rendering them prone. As for the default rules, the mount scare is off after the gambit, but a storyteller could let the unhorse gambit kill or hurt the mount to forcibly dismount an opponent. This would be difficulty 5. The distract gambit has a varying difficulty from 3 to 5. This is a gambit where the character leads, threatens or feints their target to create an opening for an ally's decisive attack. You must declare an ally who isn't crashed as beneficiary of the distraction. That ally then gains the initiative that you lose as a result of succeeding on the gambit. With a varying difficulty, this can be between 4 and 6 initiative. The beneficiary must attack the Gambit's target on their next turn, or the transferred initiative is lost. It's not possible to stack Distract Gambits to give additional bonuses to a single beneficiary. In my years of playing 3rd edition, I think I've only seen the Distract Gambit used by players once. I think it's an underutilized gambit, but it fits best in situational circumstances when you have a reason to have a particular character finish an opponent off. Perhaps if that character has a special attack required to overcome the opponent, like Ghost Eating technique. It can also be strategic to use it to give temper boosts to a high hitter who has been worn down by targeted withering attacks. In order to grapple a target, you must first determine that it's a target that can be grappled. You cannot grapple an army, for example, or something much larger and stronger than yourself. A toddler wouldn't be able to grapple a grown person, and a grown person couldn't hope to grapple a tyrant lizard. Of course, charms and other powers can circumvent these restrictions. If you have a valid target that you want to grapple, you must first succeed on the difficulty 2 gambit. After having succeeded at the gambit, you make a control roll to determine how long you can maintain the grapple. This is an opposed strength plus brawl or martial arts roll between the grappler and the target. If the target wins or ties, they break free on the next turn. If the grappler wins, they retain control for a number of additional turns equal to the successes they beat their opponent with. Once those turns are over, the target automatically escapes. During the grapple, both the grappler and the target suffers a -2 penalty to defense and cannot make flurries. The target cannot take movement actions, has a -1 penalty to attacks, and a -3 penalty to attacks using two-handed weapons. The grappler forfeits a turn of control every time they suffer an attack or take damage. If the attack both hits and deals damage, the grappler loses 2 turns of control. If the grappler is crashed, the grapple ends. Each turn during a grapple, including the turn on which it's initiated, the grappler chooses whether to savage the target, restrain or drag them, throw or slam them, or release them. They cannot take any other movement or combat actions as long as they're maintaining the grapple, but they can choose to release their target at any point, even outside of their own turn. When making a savage action, the grappler injures their opponent in some way, such as choking them, bashing them against the scenery, or stretching their joints. This functions like a withering or decisive attack where the target cannot apply defense. If withering, the attacker makes an unarmed attack roll against defense 0, and with a decisive attack they roll initiative and apply damage like normal. When making a restrain or drag action, the grappler uses up 2 rounds of control, but prevents the target from taking any action at all on their next turn. This action cannot be taken if the target won the control roll. The grappler can take a movement action if they want, dragging the victim along. This can be a useful action to take if you want to separate enemies from each other, make an abduction, or maybe drag a guard into a quiet room. When making the throw or slam action, the grappler chooses to end the grapple prematurely by slamming the target into the scenery. This works like a savage attack, but adds additional dice to the damage pool for each turn of control that's forfeited by ending the grapple. 2 dice per turn for withering, and 1 die per turn for decisive. Though this caps at a number of turns equal to the grappler's strength. The opponent is then left prone after the attack. For example, a Strength 4 character could forfeit up to 4 turns of control in order to add 8 dice to Withering damage roll or 4 dice to Decisive damage roll. Like mentioned before, gambits are often underutilized and can make combat more dynamic. But since Exalted Third Edition is already mechanically complex and many fights turn into a grind for initiative, it's understandable that players often favor building up initiative to use for killing blows. Gambits aren't perfect, and if I were to rewrite the system differently, I would probably avoid the secondary initiative roll entirely and perhaps use the gambit difficulty as initiative cost for the already successful attack. This kind of change cannot be applied as homebrew though without taking other things into consideration. But if I ever were to write an unofficial 3.5 errata, and I'm not ruling it out, I'd likely make some kind of change to how gambits are implemented. That being said, I think that gambits are definitely worth using, even in their current incarnation, and I believe that the best way to encourage players to use them more often is twofold. First, use gambits against players to show what kinds of effects they can have upon a fight. Second, incentivize their use by creating combat encounters where a successful gambit has both a narrative effect and a noticeable mechanical benefit. Create boss fights with custom gambit opportunities. For example, when the PCs go up against the powerful Abyssal Alchemist, they could use a gambit to destroy its acid vials, to both weaken the Abyssal and to prevent them from using those vials as weapons against the PCs. When they go up against the powerful giant, they could use a gambit to trip the giant so that its face is brought closer to the ground, making it more vulnerable to attacks. When they go up against the huge automaton construct in the Forgotten First Stage Vault, the PCs can use gambits to attack the construct essence cores, causing them to overcharge and explode. When they go up against the Tick Lunar Lady of the Crimson Nectar, they can use a gambit to rupture her blood sac and force her off her throne. When they go up against the mad ghost of their fallen comrade, the PCs could use a gambit to show the ghost its face in a mirror to stun it, or to make it recall its identity and past. There are plenty of ways to use gambits as a tool for making combat more interesting. If you want to create a dynamic boss fight in Exalted 3rd Edition, think of a few ways that gambits can be utilized in order to make a notable change in the battle. Make sure that gambit has a dramatic narrative effect with a significant benefit, and give subtle hints to the players that these alternative combat options are there. If it's too overt, the players may feel like railroading their combat decisions. If it's too subtle, the players may miss out on them entirely and the battle becomes the usual grind for initiative. If the players feel like the gambit is their own idea, it will have more emotional impact. But if you start out by preparing some gambit options to make the players used to those kinds of options being viable in combat, it's likely that players will be encouraged to take more incentives of their own in the future, and perhaps create gambit opportunities on the spot, even if you hadn't planned for them beforehand. Then, all of a sudden, all of your combat scenes have the possibility of becoming more dynamic and engaging for both you and your players. Until next time.